you looking to sharpen your budgeting skills? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast, where we talk about life, family, and how to afford it. And now, the Budget Couple themselves, Nate and Danielle.
Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast. I'm Nate.
And I'm Danielle.
And this week, we're going to talk about starting out and kind of answering some questions that we've gotten from a listener about what to do when you're first getting married. So we'll kind of go through the process and talk about that. But before we do that, we want to implore you to please leave a review on the podcast, either through Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast player you use. We really appreciate it and helps us bring more viewers to the show. So let's go ahead and get into this.
To start off, we're just going to read a little bit of the email to give you guys some context of the listener and what some of their questions were and what their situation was. So I am a college graduate and currently am pursuing my doctorate in physical therapy. I'll be getting married in the near future and will have student loan debt from my graduate program. So there's the situation. And then she goes on to ask a few different questions, mostly related to things that probably a lot of couples out there ask when they're thinking about getting married or are engaged and about to get married and are wondering about, hey, I have student loan debt, he doesn't. Should we go ahead and combine incomes, combine accounts, or vice versa, maybe in other situations? Then also things like whether or not to rent or buy your first house. Do you wait till you get a little more settled, or do you go ahead and just buy the house right off the bat? And then also, what about setting out that budget? Do you wait a little bit, see how you guys work together, or do you go ahead and set that budget up right away and just jump in? So those were the three main questions that were asked, and we kind of go through and address those one by one here.
So diving into the first question about combining the debts that you have. Now, this could be debt from one person, both people, or in a perfect world, nobody has debt, but that's not where we live. So what do we do if one person's bringing debt into a marriage? And our personal view of this, and the listener also kind of agreed with this, is saying that what's mine is yours, where we're joining forces. We are now a team. So the bad parts of what I bring along are also your bad parts now. And the good parts I bring along are also your good parts. And we attack all of this stuff together because the better and closer we can be a team, the more effective our marriage is going to be.
Now, for student loan debt, for some people I know out there, you're using a student loan forgiveness program. Maybe I believe they're for nonprofits and government and such. So if you're using something like that where you pay the loan off over like 10 years and then they forgive whatever is beyond that you haven't paid, we don't necessarily endorse that. But if that's the case, if that's what you're using, there might be something you want to consider, because if you get married and you combine incomes, then obviously your taxable income, if you file jointly, is going to go up quite a bit. So in that case, a lot of the times the payments on these forgiveness programs are based on what your income is. So in that case, your payment would also probably go up. So that's just something to consider about combining incomes.
Yeah, and just one other kind of to play devil's advocate on there. If you're married but filing single as a single person, you're paying more in taxes because of that. So the tax savings might not be as great as you think they are because you're going to be paying the most. A single working person pays more in taxes than pretty much anybody else once you get to a certain income level. I think it's like around $30,000. It's not a lot, and you get killed in taxes. So filing jointly gives you a tax savings right off the bat.
So what we would actually recommend is to not use any sort of forgiveness program, but just to attack the debt as quickly and as intensely as possible. So go ahead, combine your incomes, get some tax breaks for being married. And then now that you have that combined larger income, go ahead and pay that debt down as quickly as you can. In the long run, it probably will actually save you more money than the forgiveness program because you aren't going to be paying as much in interest. If you can pay it off in a few years, not only are you done with debt really quickly, but you also probably saved tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, on interest payments.
It also opens up a whole lot of freedom for you because oftentimes if you're on one of those forgiveness programs, you're stuck at a job or a type of job that has it. So if you can pay off the debt, you're no longer trapped by that, and it can open up a lot of possibilities that were not there for you beforehand. But again, that's just going off on a little tangent that we had with kind of paying off debt and student loan debt if you were pursuing debt forgiveness. Our personal recommendation is you combine your debts and you work on paying them off as quickly as possible.
The second question was about renting versus buying. And this is a complex, tough question, tough decision. It's one we struggled with a little bit before we bought our house. So We would say that you ask yourself 3 key questions to start with. How long do I plan on being in the location that you're buying the house at? How familiar are you with the area? And then how much money do you have saved for things like down payment, repairs within the first year or so, if that's a necessity, and then also to maintain your emergency fund through the process of buying the house.
Yeah. Now we've been married 8 years now, a little over. Yeah, a little over because it's winter time almost.
About 8.5.
Yeah, 8.5. Let's go with that one. And we rented for 5 of those years. Now, part of that was because when we asked the question of how long are we going to be in this location, when we lived in Texas, we were there for a year. When we lived in Delaware, we knew Danielle's school program was going to take 4 years. So we planned on being there for at least 4. And it turns out she moved out of there before the 4 years was even up. Yeah. So we were there and we finally got an apartment in Maryland, not far from where we live now. And we rented until we got familiar with the area and we were able to buy a house.
So one of the things you want to consider is like we said, how much money do you have saved and whether or not you're going to be able to recoup that money that you spend on the house over the time that you're there. So that's really something about how long you plan to be in the location. So after closing costs and other types of fees, you actually spend a lot more than you would expect when you buy a house. And it usually takes several years for that value to raise enough to be able to really recoup the costs. There's no perfect rule of thumb for this, but somewhere between 3 and 5 years is probably a good minimum. So if you know you're going to be in the location that long, then maybe you think about buying a house.
Yeah. Now, if you're in a really hot market where houses are just growing crazy in value, then maybe you might want to consider something else. But for us, 5 years is what I was always taught. And I mean, all the financial books I've ever read or podcast or blogs I've read all suggest at least 5 years. I think it's a good rule of thumb to follow just because it allows you to account for errors and dips in the market and allow them to correct. Because generally house values aren't going to stay down straight for 5 years. They're eventually going to come back up and that will help you be able to move on to the next prospect if you want to.
Also, how familiar are you with the area? This is something to think about if you want to have kids in the future, or if you already have kids. What's the schools like? And resale value is also another thing. So think about, are the houses moving off the market quickly in that area? So if you do want to sell in 5 years, is it going to be something that's easy, or is it maybe going to be tough? So those are just some things to think about when it comes to time frame too.
Yeah. And we also looked at, when we picked our house, we looked at crime statistics in the area. We looked at how much insurance generally went, how much taxes generally were. There's a lot of information to look at, and you can really only get all that information if you give yourself some time to become familiar with the area and to learn the numbers. Because just looking on Zillow or Trudello or whatever it's called, it's not going to give you all the information you need right off the gate. You do have to set some time and judge, what is a house actually worth in this area? Am I being ripped off? Am I getting a great deal? Am I paying market value? And you can only really learn that with a little bit of time and knowing the area.
And I guess I'll just throw this out here for how much money you should have saved. It really is important to think about how much extra crap you're going to spend when you buy a house. It's not just that cost of the house. Even if you get the closing costs mostly paid for you, there's other random fees that go into it. And then on top of that, you'll more than likely have to buy some stuff for the house. There might be some light repairs. Maybe you want to do painting, you buy some new furniture. It adds up quicker than you would expect, actually. And then you also have to be prepared for if your water heater goes up or your whatever. Nate's better at this stuff.
Yeah, if your HVAC system goes out, if you have a pipe burst, there's tons of problems that could pop up in a house. And unlike renting, where you're not really responsible for anything other than writing a check every month, you're responsible to fix that. So if, let's say, a water line busts in the front of your yard and your whole yard turns to a swamp and you have $1,000 water bill because the water ran and it went through your meter, those things do happen and you are responsible for them. And if you don't have the money to back it up, you can be in real trouble.
So part of that is also making sure you maintain that emergency fund. So if you buy a house and you have all this stuff going along with it, make sure you're not touching that emergency fund. Make sure you leave that cushion there, whatever it needs to be for you, and just let it sit in case you need it for an actual emergency during the first year or two of the home buying experience.
A lot of people consider rent kind of throwing away money because you're not getting any tangible asset other than a roof over your head when you're putting all this money out. And I agree to some extent, but what you're paying for is freedom. You have the freedom to pick up and move wherever you want. You have the freedom to kind of do what you want, and you have the freedom not to have to worry about a lot of stuff. So while you're paying a bit of money, freedom-wise, you get a whole bunch more back. And generally, I mean, if you break down the numbers between what you pay in repairs a year in a house and then what you do in rent, you're really not coming out ahead by buying. The only thing is that you get a tangible asset at the end of everything, after that 30 or 15 years or whatever you wind up paying it off in.
The big thing with a house is it is actually an investment. I'll go a little devil's advocate and say that rent kind of can be throwing away money, in that you could have invested that money into a home that could potentially bring you more money later on when you sell it. So it is an investment. It's just also a risk, and you have to just know how to balance that and whether or not you are able to take on the risk to do this investment at the time. So moving on to that third question about budgeting, and this is something we talked about really early on, but we were asked basically when we created our budget. Was it as soon as we got married, that first week we sat down and got into it, or did we kind of let things settle and just figure it out? And I would say that we did probably a mixture of both, actually. We realized probably within a billing cycle or two of our credit cards that we were spending things and we weren't recording them. We didn't really know where our money was going. So that's when we sat down and made our first budget. It probably didn't start really working for us, though, until a few months after that first budget. So no, it wasn't completely like the first week. It wasn't that we each had budgets going in and we combined them. We kind of let things settle a little bit. And I guess our budget has gotten a bit more complicated as we've changed jobs, as we've made more money.
As we've added creatures to our lives.
Yes. So it's taken time to really dial in on what the right numbers are and what works for us. And we really still are doing that. But I would say that it's really only been in the last maybe 4 years or so that we've hit a good stride. And like we said before, we've been married a little over 8 now. So it's probably taken a little while here to get to a point where we're getting happy with our budget.
Yeah, and it wasn't that our budgets before that weren't working. They were. It's just that as time goes on, we've been able to really discover what our spending habits are. We've been able to sniff out problems that we have with our budget, and we've really been able to dial it in for us. It worked before, but it keeps working better. And I think that's one of the things that I love about a budget is that when it dials in perfectly, it's just like the coolest feeling that you really went through and did something, you set up a plan and accomplished it. And it's just a really good feeling.
The final question was about what's changed the most with our budget. And that's actually a really good question. It leads from what we just said. It's the reason I think that we've really hit a good stride in the last 4 years or so is because we've dedicated ourselves to retirement funding a little bit more, and also paying off our house debt, which came about in the last 4 years. But when I was in grad school, we really weren't thinking about retirement at that point. For better or for worse, it wasn't in our budget. And now that it's really a big part of our budgeting, it just seems more complete.
Yeah, I think that when we've taken a look and really just focused on being able to set things up for the future for us, that put a whole different spin on our budget. It put a different focus on what we wanted to focus on. And I think that's important, that we not only saw the money coming in and we're able to do things with it in the present tense, but we're also planning for the future and getting things set up for down the road so that our lives are easier and we're more financially secure down the road. And that's where we want to be, and it makes us feel a lot more comfortable, I think.
So those were some really awesome questions, and we really appreciate hearing from you guys. Please continue to send us some emails. If you have questions, suggestions, thoughts, just let us know. We look forward to hearing from you guys.
Yeah, thanks so much, listener Aaron, for sending in those questions. We greatly appreciate it. And remember, you can always submit questions by going to the budgetcouple.com website and clicking on that contact form, and it goes directly to my email address. So we will get it and we respond to you as quickly as we can. Show notes for this episode can be found at budgetcouple.com/episode 17, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Budget Couple Podcast with your hosts, Nate and Danielle. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit budgetcouple.com. Make sure to check out the next episode of the Budget Couple Podcast, where we'll talk more about life, family, and how to afford it. We'll catch you next time.